Rowland, and I was first introduced to Brigadier Toby when I first transferred into the Army Medical Services. So he was my first boss, and a boss that I have followed and tracked ever since. So it's absolutely a delight to introduce Brigadier Toby, who's served for 28 years in the Defence Medical Services, and he holds a range of leadership appointments focused on the preparation, deployment and command of field healthcare in a variety of operational and austere environments. Internationally, this included serving as UK's overall military medical commander in Iraq in 2007, Afghanistan in 2013, and as well as NATO's head of medical capability development and training. Brigadier Toby has also served as a senior medical commander to the UK's Armoured Division and as commander of the UK's Medical Brigade. His most recent appointments has included the head of Defence Medical Academy and head of leadership development for the Defence Medical Services. And it is within these roles that Brigadier Toby has explored the application and practice of authentic leadership and how it can improve behaviours and culture within healthcare settings. That's the professional introduction. Brigadier Toby is a big supporter of climb, and he came to the Cohort 2 summit and delivered a speech for us there. Brigadier Toby is Welsh and proud, and it is absolutely my honour to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Brigadier Toby. Over to you.
Oh, Kel, thanks so much indeed. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Wonderful, excellent. Well, Bore da, and wonderful to be with you all today. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to engage once again with the future leadership of healthcare within Wales. Before I start, I'd just like to make the point that all the opinions I express today are my own. I would just ask that we use sort of Chatham House rules for our discussions today. And for questions, I'll try and leave some time at the end for any questions, but also if anyone's got any follow-up points or wants to connect, on my final slide, I'll include all my contact details if anyone wishes to follow up. By way of sort of declaration of interest, I left full-time military service at the end of last year, and since then I've been pursuing a portfolio career, doing a little bit of work for defence, doing some consultancy and some associate advisor work for a range of firms, and also working with a couple of universities. And what I'd really like to do with this session is, I'm fully aware of the work that the Ed Talks play within the Climb environment about sharing personal experiences and what's shaped one in one's career, and I'll certainly do that. But what I'd also like to do is use that as a bridge to connect some of the other themes that are being looked at today and tomorrow, certainly connecting with the outcome of our healthcare that you've been looking at with Muir this morning, thinking about how power and leadership relates to leadership, that we'll be looking at with our colleagues from John Hopkins this afternoon, and then perhaps taking that more widely into culture change in general, which I know Muir is going to cover tomorrow. And so I'll sort of direct all of that work into our personal roles and responsibilities as leaders, and how our behaviour can really have a positive impact, or indeed a detrimental impact, on those around us in the practice of healthcare, and in particular to creating the right safety culture. And so that will probably be the strapline that I'll offer, linking all of the things I'll share today. In terms of what that looks like in terms of a bit of a content, if you wish, I'll start off with some match highlights of some of the shaping factors in my life up until now, but then link that into how those interactions and those very personal experiences really came to guide my approach to leadership development and my work subsequently in leadership behaviours, human factors, and how that relates to safety culture. And you'll be pleased to know what I'll do is distill that down into 3 skills which I think really make a difference. And I've looked at this in a number of operational settings in difficult situations. And so 3 skills which I think will hopefully make a difference. And then I'll round off by really having a quick look to the future, and perhaps we can have a discussion around where leadership development will go within the NHS, bringing it right up to date with the work that's been trailed on leadership competencies. So that's really what I'd like to look at. In terms of those match highlights, if you like, and where I've come from into all of this, as Kel quite rightly said, I'm a proud Welshman, and that story began in 1968 in what the poets refer to as the Great Green Rolling Desert of Mid Wales, and I'm from Llandrindod in Radnorshire. My father was a baker and a grocer from Khumbu, and my mother was a secretary from local farming stock. And so I grew up with a large extended family, and it was a family that got a bit larger when my maternal grandmother moved in with us when I was 5. And really that created a really wonderful foundation for my childhood. You know, growing up in Llandrindod, for those of you who know it, it's a wonderful Victorian spa town, great architecture, you know, wide streets, great luscious countryside around. And so had a, you know, idyllic childhood in many respects. But I think also, as was characteristic of the time and probably that area, modest expectations were the norm. And one very often heard, and I certainly heard directed at myself, don't get ideas above your station. But nonetheless, I had some very powerful values inculcated in me from my upbringing. I think from my father, I took a very strong work ethic. From my mother, I took a no-nonsense attitude to getting things done. From my maternal grandmother, when she moved in, a sense of commitment and selflessness and committing to one's cause. And from the heroes that I sort of worshipped as a child, both sporting and in fiction, I was always drawn to those who had a real sense of integrity and some real moral courage and a moral compass about them all. But that's not without, that childhood was not without challenges. My maternal grandmother, having formed really close bonds with her, she died very suddenly when I was 12 in the summer of 1981, and then was followed just 9 months later by the death of my father at the age of 39 from congenital heart failure in the Easter of 82. And so my mother was faced with having lost her 2 key support networks within 9 months of each other. And that really forced us to, change and develop as a family. And I think the additional values I certainly took from that were a sense of resilience and a lot of self-reliance in what I wanted to do. Behind all of that, I think, was always a desire, a secret desire to want to join the army, but it was not one that was encouraged, and certainly not by my careers advisor, who I remember when I shared this with when I was 13, told me, well, you won't last long on the streets of Northern Ireland. Well, I was 13 at the time, so I probably wouldn't have done, but so therefore I kept that to myself, focused on my studies, and worked hard. Initially, I was aiming to go into a technical trade within the army, and then potentially as an officer. And then I became the first member of my family to go to university and went to Aberystwyth to study cellular biology and immunology. Really fell in love with academia, and that took me to commence a PhD at Liverpool in 91 in leukemia research. But I still wanted to scratch that itch with the military. So I joined the reserves, joined the Territorial Army, and really did enjoy it. I think I found my tribe there. And I think that combined at the same time as a realization that I found, the bench work of lab work quite isolating. And so I took the plunge, joined the regular army and was commissioned into the Royal Army Medical Corps as a medical support officer in 1995. And medical support officers, of which Kel and I were both in that cadre, responsible for the command, the planning, and the leadership of the units. We create the framework into which many of our clinicians come from healthcare and then deliver their skills on operations. And what I really enjoyed about the military environment, and which I find a lot of commonality with healthcare in general, is it's that it's teamwork, it's the people you mix with, it's that common sense of purpose, it's having that clear outcome for your efforts and immediate feedback, as well as being part of that higher calling that I think probably my grandmother embedded within me. But most of all, probably within the military, what I enjoyed was the trust to get on and deliver, and the freedom of action one was given to use one's initiative in isolated settings. So those are all the positives, but all the positives are not without challenges themselves. I think within the military, and I think certainly to be in any form of leadership position, I think one has to accept responsibility, and sometimes that can weigh quite heavily. And I think we also have to accept some problems are quite wicked, and we have to take on some quite difficult decisions. And so, as I've gone through all of those command appointments that Kel shared, I've certainly been faced with the situations where I felt in some pretty big shoes and feeling slightly out of one's depth in the situation one's facing, and having to to get the support of colleagues and seek guidance from others in terms of navigating and become comfortable in those settings. And certainly in those tours of Iraq, second tour of Iraq certainly, and first tour of Afghanistan, incredibly hard settings. But what's increasingly become important to me, and I've put more and more effort into as my career has gone on, is the interpersonal, is the investment in people. And when one thinks about leadership in that setting, and this is where I'll sort of pivot into thinking about how we as leaders can make a difference within healthcare. I'd like to start with a bit of a people-centered definition of leadership, which I find is quite helpful. And it comes from what some people describe as a definitive work around the encapsulation of leadership theory and practice, which is by Peter Northouse. And he draws together, as I'm sure you can appreciate, the incredibly wide and diverse amount of work and writing on the subject of leadership. And in doing that work over a number of years, he distilled down what he considered to be, the core element of what one can have as a common definition of leadership. And I'll just show that with you now. Now, the first time I saw this definition, I wasn't particularly inspired by it. It's in many ways quite vanilla, but actually the longer I've sat and lived with it, the more I do like it, and particularly how it applies within a healthcare setting, because it's very egalitarian. It has that sense of being without rank, without status. It yet gets across the point that it's one person having an impact on more than one other person. And it's about influence. And so it's almost like leading without authority. And what it says to me is the truism that, with any setting, be it the military or healthcare, where it's a very dynamic and very uncertain as to what's coming through the door at any one time, you've got to have an approach where you bring all of the team in and everyone has a chance to make a contribution. So what does that mean in terms of leadership within healthcare? Well, I think looking back over healthcare over the last 20 years and its approach to leadership, it's very similar to wider industry in that there's a huge amount of work that's going on leadership in the private and the public sector. Multiple sources are writing on the subject, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And for the NHS, that's meant a wide range of publications. And I just put a small fraction of them on the screen here, looking at leadership from a number of different perspectives. And certainly within the military, we've been looking at leadership as one of the core aspects of our work for hundreds of years. And so with all of that work, you'd have thought, well, actually, it should all be solved by now. We should all be really good leaders and we should know what works in certain situations. Well, if that's the case, well, I would say that in the military, the product of poor leadership is defeat in battle. And within healthcare, the product is poor leadership is most often the public inquiry. And in the 70 odd years of the NHS's history, there have been over 100 public inquiries into healthcare in one form or another. Now, that's not just the big spectaculars of the Ockenden Review or mid-staffs, but it's all down to those local reviews into care as well. And interestingly, what is defined as many as the first modern public inquiry into healthcare took place in Wales in Ely Hospital in Cardiff. Started in 1968 and was published in 69. And that focused on the ill treatment of patients in what was a mental health facility where patients were being physically and mentally abused. Staff were stealing from the patients, and the standard of care was pretty poor. And what that review, and sadly, the reviews and the inquiries before and afterwards, keep highlighting common cultural themes that are related to leadership and our behaviours within those settings. Those themes are, poor leadership, problems with teamwork and communication, and a tribalism existing within the staff, within the different cadres. And that, gives rise to both hierarchies in terms of rank and status, but also a power imbalance within the staff and between the staff and the patients. For people in those settings who perhaps are struggling in those situations, there's a tendency to become disengaged with the situation. And for those who speak out, sadly, they are often sidelined, and professional isolation is weaponized in order to maintain the status quo. I'm hoping that no one has had to put up with culture of that sort. And if you haven't, a really useful historical document, which is available on YouTube, from 1968, from the same time as the Ely Hospital inquiry was going on, is a World in Action program called Ward F13, and you can just Google that and it will come up. It's about a 30-minute program. And World in Action was a Wednesday evening documentary series on ITV, which was very well regarded. And this World in Action special focused on Powick Hospital, which was then classed as an asylum near Worcester, which was having some real challenges in terms of service pressure, staffing and capacity. And trigger warning, I say this now, if you do have a look at that video, and it is really worth watching, it is a distressing watch. And the reason I sort of direct you towards it is there are some very frank expressions from the staff across the organisation as to what's going on there. And you see the full range of experiences expressed, from absolute acceptance that this is the way it's got to be because this is the only thing we can do in the circumstances, to people wishing things were different but just getting on with it, to actually just a couple of voices saying, look, I don't think this is acceptable and I'm going to leave. And I think there's a freedom of expression perhaps we wouldn't see so freely expressed today. So well worth a watch, because it is a microcosm of this sort of situation. And what those 100-odd inquiries and their lessons repeatedly identify is the need for culture change. It's repeatedly stated, but actually, if you look at all of them, there's very few practical proposals for how to do it and how to get after it, because it's easier to say than it is perhaps to do. So what can we do about it? I'll offer some thoughts in a moment on that. But there is some really interesting work that the NHS has done on this subject. And the first one was published in 2022, and it was around positive safety culture. And it went out to learn from best practice. And they went out and looked at organisations who had been rated either good or outstanding by the CQC for the overall delivery of care, and looked at not only what was being done, but how it was being done within the organisation. And as a result of that, the NHS came up with a definition of what was a positive safety culture. And that was defined as one where the environment is collaboratively crafted with all of the involved parties, not just the staff and the patients, the families and the carers. And there were some common themes that came out. It was about enabling and empowering people to speak up, to have that wonderful thing of continuous learning and an acceptance of the need to improve as a result of where safety issues are identified or failings occur, and to create that supportive, psychologically safe teamwork that we very often hear of. Now, psychological safety is hopefully something that everyone's familiar with. And Amy Edmondson first published her work in this area in 1999. And it's that belief with psychological safety that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with either a question, a concern, or ideas, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And so it's about people being able to bring their ideas and their professional observations to the table. And it's worth bearing in mind that whilst Edmondson published that work in 1999, it only really came into most people's sphere of recognition in 2016 when Google had applied psychological safety within its organization, and a New York Times reporter went out and captured that at Google, and that article that was then subsequently published really kicked off the psychological safety movement that we're all familiar with today. Now, in terms of how that applies to us, there's a development on psychological safety, which I'll just draw to your attention. And it was some work by Tim Clark a couple of years ago, where he wrote that there are actually 4 stages in psychological safety, and I think they're useful for not only thinking about the organizations to which we belong, but perhaps also thinking about the teams within which we operate. And what Tim Clark wrote was that psychological safety can be characterized in 4 stages, 4 levels, if you like. At a foundation level, everyone must feel included. You then must feel safe to learn, feel safe to contribute, and then, if you've achieved those 3, safe to challenge the status quo. And again, without fear of being embarrassed, marginalized, or punished. And I wonder, if we think about the organizations we serve in now, the teams we're part of, and perhaps the teams we've been part of, where would you score them on that scale? And how do we help our people get to the place where they can challenge that status quo? And how do we as leaders enable that? Going back to that NHS report from 2022 on the subject, the key lessons that they took from the organizations that they studied around psychological safety and its application in practice was that the importance of involving staff, and you can build psychological safety through starting that engagement process. You can make oneself be more accessible. One can convey one's intent through use of storytelling for greater impact. And it can build on that importance of making a personal connection with staff and getting to know your staff and your colleagues on a one-to-one level. And it's one thing I've noticed in recent years, certainly since COVID, is that with the service pressures that everyone's under, people are more, there is an increasing tendency to focus in on getting on with your part, one's own part of the puzzle. And there's a degree of those boundaries sort of shifting in through almost a self-protection mechanism. I'm very happy to be challenged about this in questions. And so we forget that personal connection at probably our peril. And taking the time to show appreciation, show value to other people for their contributions, and just take that time to say thank you, and to really be appreciative. So if that's something we can all do, irrespective of our position in the leadership hierarchy, what can perhaps the leaders of the teams, the organizations, and the services perhaps provide? Well, the NHS pointed to 2 things that are really key. And the first one is vision, having a clear sense of what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to achieve? So everyone has an idea of what's the big picture. I think someone's microphone's on, so I'll just offer that just in case anyone's picking up some feedback. So having a clear vision, and then in terms of behaviors, leading by example, be a role model for the best.
Toby, sorry to interrupt, but I think you may have muted yourself.
I don't know how that happened.
There you go. I can hear you again. Sorry about that.
That's right. Cool. So, what I think is important about the leadership, the vision, and the behaviours is that it actually mirrors some work that was done within the Ministry of Defence a couple of years ago. As you're aware, there are some really big equipment programs and capabilities that we have within defence, and our major project teams are responsible for doing things like building aircraft carriers and constructing the next fleet of fighter aircraft. And it's high pressure, high stakes, big money, a lot of public scrutiny. And so they looked at what created psychological safety within those teams. And they found that there was a 40%, 40% variation in effectiveness between those teams that had a clear vision and consistent reasonable behaviors with those that didn't. 40% variation. And so the work that the NHS did on this by looking at those high-performing organisations around vision and consistent behaviours from the leadership team, well worth taking on board for the work that we do within our settings. And if one needed any more proof that actually taking that time to have the human engagement, that human touch is important, then I would only just direct you towards the report from the GMC that came out earlier this year, which was looking at the workplace experience and how that was affecting the retention of general practitioners within the workplace. And the key factors that were found to be encouraging doctors to remain in practice within the UK were the demonstration and the practice of compassionate leadership, which I'm sure everyone will be familiar with from the work of Michael West, who I know has the leadership hub within HEIW, and I'll touch on Michael's work shortly. Showing people they are valued, ensuring people feel empowered and listened to, and that also people are being part of supportive in inclusive environments. So that's a lot of download from me in terms of the weight of evidence that's been accumulated as to why these things are important. What does that mean for each of us here in terms of how we can make a difference within our settings? Well, what I've sort of learned from all of the organizations and situations into which I've been placed as a leader is that it's about being true to oneself. It's about being as authentic as possible. And I find the best leaders are the ones whose actions and approaches are very much grounded into who they are as a person and what their character is, rather than trying to be something they're not, or perhaps be someone who they are not. Authentic leadership, if you wish. And there is a wonderful quote that I think encapsulates this perfectly, and I'll just share that with you now. It's from Field Marshal William Slim, who was the commander of the 14th Army in Burma during the Second World War. And the 14th Army at the beginning of that campaign was in a pretty bad state, having been pushed back by the advancing Japanese forces. And when Field Marshal Slim was put in charge of it, it really needed to be turned around and turned around quick because the situation was quite a dire one. And through his own personal character, his own personal leadership, and to be frank, set himself up as a role model to both support and also to energize and direct. He really turned the 14th Army around, and his book, A Defeat into Victory, is a really cracking read. And it's one actually that in a communication with Samir over the last couple of days, I found out is actually one of his favorite books as well. And I think this idea of projection of personality, it is a personal thing because it's just plain you. I think that's so important, because when the pressure comes on, when we're tired, when we're cold, when we're hungry, whatever it is, it's if you're being yourself and you're being authentic, then that will give you the resilience. And that's certainly something that's proven to be the case for me throughout my career. So I promised to offer you sort of 3 tips, if you like, for things that we can all practice to make a difference in these settings. And I'll share those with you, and I'll illustrate them with some personal examples from my career, if I may. And the first skill, which I'm sure people will be familiar with, is that of active listening. If you're not familiar with it, it's simply about, I think, when things are busy, when things are difficult, and someone comes up to you with an issue or a challenge, just take that time to stop, focus your attention on the person who's come up to speak to you, and give them your full attention. And it then goes beyond that. Listen to what the person is saying. Take time to understand, particularly if it's something that's important to them, or you can see that they're in a bit of distress. take time to understand, and rather than practice what we all do probably a bit too much, is look for the opportunity to step in, to contribute. Be ready to reflect back to the speaker, a bit of a précis of what they've said to you and why. And by doing that, it not only I found that when one is tired, it makes you, forces yourself to bring yourself back into that interpersonal relationship, but it keeps you engaged, and it also sends that very clear message to the speaker that you have been listened to, you've been invested in at that moment in time. Now, I don't underestimate how difficult that is to do, particularly when you're tired, but my goodness, it can make a difference in those challenge situations, and it can really make a difference to a team. If you haven't seen it happen, actually the Civil Service Learning website has got a really good little module on how to practice active listening. You don't have to be a civil servant to get an account with it, provided you use your government or your NHS email address to register. You can sign up to it, and there's some really good stuff on there. And my top tip is that if done properly, active listening really does take that time and energy and effort to do, but my goodness, it pays dividends. And the reflection I've got about its effectiveness was that when I was first exposed to active listening, probably about 10 or 12 years ago, I went on this course, and it included an active listening segment, and I saw its power in the the one-to-one sessions that we were having. And so when I came home that evening, and I was chatting to my romantic partner, and she was telling me about her day, I started applying active listening to what she was saying, and it really made the conversation flow. And after what had been a really tiring day for her, it really energized her. But then she did stop in her tracks at one moment and said, "Are you having an affair?" I did at that point say, no, I've just been on a course. But that just gives you a bit of a sense of the difference that it can make, even to someone who knows you really, really well. And I've seen it make a real difference in those pressurized situations. The second skill I'd sort of offer is that of compassionate leadership and the work of Michael West. And this is almost like a stablemate of active listening, but it goes, if I would offer a bit of another step further, in that it starts with that attending and taking time to be with someone and notice what's going on, and taking to understand through that dialogue with them what's the root of the cause of distress within them. It does encourage you to empathize, but being mindful, not to the point of being overwhelmed with what's happening, and then going that step further into thinking, right, what intelligent action can I now take to help relieve the other's suffering, to perhaps give them some sort of help. That phrase, "how can I help," can be hugely powerful in this sort of setting. And I've seen this work because in one of my previous roles, I was involved in defence engagement. That was building bridges with other armed forces overseas, and healthcare was at the leading edge of that because it's non-contentious. Relief of suffering is universal, and it enabled us to engage with a number of countries who perhaps wouldn't engage with us militarily on other issues. And I was on a defence engagement visit to a country in Eastern Europe. I shan't name it, but it was a former Soviet country, and I was in the capital and been there for a couple of days. And there was a really big military hospital there. It was a 2,000+ bed facility, huge organisation that had been built during the Cold War, and it was primarily intended for the military and their casualties during battle, and had actually taken on its peacetime function of looking after not only the military but also their families as well. But when I went there after the Cold War, it had evolved within the capital city to also, on one day a week, opening its doors for anyone in the general population who wanted to come along and receive treatment. And I'd been there for a couple of days, and I turned up on the morning when it was opened up to the general population. And I was there just as dawn was breaking, really early in the morning. And I would not wish to guess how long the queue was to get into the front of that facility. It was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And everyone waiting peacefully in an orderly manner, waiting to be triaged and to be seen. And these were people who couldn't afford healthcare normally, and this was their only chance of receiving it. And I remember walking through the front door of the hospital, And there was one person there literally with a hatchet embedded in his head, with some cloth wrapped around it, holding it in place. And it clearly, just by looking at the state of the dressing, been there for several days. You can imagine that walking then through the facility, that I'd been there for a couple of days, it was a real change. And it was like having a known mass casualty situation turning up. And I was in ICU, which was probably had been built for about 40 beds and had 60 in there. And there were 4 members of staff on, trying their best in the situation. And it was full. It was full by about 10 a.m. in the morning, with some really poor and sick people in there, with, to be quite frank, labour breathing. You could see some people there were not long for this world. Nonetheless, the staff came over and spoke to me. I certainly did not request it. And I applied compassionate listening in that, compassionate leadership in that sort of situation, taking time to listen and try to understand what it was like working that facility. And to be the staff, we're talking about, what had come in through the door that day, what sort of activity, what actions they were taking in order to treat and care and support. And the point I sort of offered them, listening to what they were saying, is, so if I understand this correctly, on this one day a week, you get this major incident taking place. And from having dealt with major incidents on operations several times, you've then got a couple of days of working through that, clearing all the critically and the severely injured and ill, and then a couple of days of bedding them in and dealing with as best as possible. Then probably one day when you're back to sort of relative normality before it all happens again. And I just simply asked, what's it like to be on the receiving end of that? It must be awful. And the team that was standing there, 2 doctors and a couple of nurses, it took them by surprise, to be quite frank. And you could see that the emotion below the surface. And they said, yes, it's incredibly difficult situation to be in. And to be frank, they keep doing it because they know that it's making a difference for all the people who are visiting that facility. And that's what gets them up in the morning. But my goodness, it's taking a toll on them, because it keeps getting worse, not necessarily better. I had with me some really small tokens, some badges from the unit I was leading at the time, which, in any defence engagement activity, they're gizzets, little things you give out to people, for making you a cup of tea or whatever. But it's all I had to offer. So I just gave one to each of the team, and I shook their hands and I said, I thanked them for what they were doing to relieve the suffering of others. And to be quite frank, there were tears. These really hard-bitten clinicians who had put up with goodness knows what, there were tears of emotion. And they said, one of them spoke up and they said, look, I've been working here 10 years. My colleagues have been working here longer. And this is the first time in 10 years that anyone has engaged with us as people. And it's the first time, I'm sorry, I'll get emotional at this point. It's the first time anyone said thank you to us. And it made a real difference in their day. And so what I would just offer to you is that no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, making that effort to reach out to someone else can make a real difference. And don't underestimate the power that you hold. The third skill I just offer to you is psychological safety. Amy Edmondson has written on particularly how psychological safety can be applied within healthcare. And she looks at how it can be used to sort of lead without having any sort of formal authority. And she emphasises from her studies with a number of healthcare organisations, including the NHS, the importance of inviting everyone to participate, making sure everyone's got a voice and they know that they can make a contribution. Easier said than done sometimes. And the personal reflection I'll offer for this is that I was in charge of an organisation that had a significant number of safeguarding responsibilities. And I said to my senior leadership team, after we'd done a lot of work in the first 6 months to make sure that we knew what was going on, or to the best of our ability, look, I want someone from the population we are safeguarding on our senior leadership team. So I want someone to be our critical friend, someone to hold us account and give us a bit of a reality check about how we step forward now and start making a difference in terms of the application. And when I sort of discussed this with the team, there was a bit of pushback from my senior leadership team and a couple of queries. But I said, no, I think this is something we ought to do. And everyone sort of, I would say, deferred to me. And I asked them to go out and say, right, go and find me someone who's appropriate from that safeguarded population to come onto the board. And there was a lot of heel dragging. No one wanted to go and find me someone. And what I then found out is I was pushing it. Look, where's the volunteer? My deputy then came into me and said, look, there's a lot of pushback from the senior leadership team about bringing this other person on board. And I couldn't understand why, because 95% of the things we were discussing were, to be quite frank, would have been boring to someone on the safeguarded population. But for that 5%, that crucial things that were going to make a difference to the people we were looking after, I think it was important to have that voice. And actually, with one of the individuals on my senior leadership team, as I pushed ahead with this agenda, it got to the point where they were threatening to file a complaint against me for making them uncomfortable. From really what I thought was opening up that debate and making sure that everyone had a voice. And so I firmly believe in the importance of having that full and open discussion, but be prepared for the fact that you may get some pushback with it, but it is certainly worth doing. So those are the three skills, and I promised to sort of round off with have a look at so what for leadership development within the NHS, where are we heading next? As I mentioned earlier, leadership and management development in the NHS has had a lot of attention put into it, particularly since 2010. And that was when the first Francis report was published into mid-staffs and made a number of recommendations about how management and leadership development should go forward within the NHS. And Francis stopped short of actually saying that there should be some formal professional standards of practice, formal regulation of leadership. And in 2012, as the sort of the direct result of Francis, the NHS Leadership Academy was set up, and it's been doing some great work over the intervening decade or so. But what we had in a couple of years ago in 2022 was the work of General Gordon Messenger and Dame Linda Pollard into NHS leadership and taking stock of all of that. And you remember Gordon Messenger for his role within the coronation, as well as being the second most senior officer within British Defence when he was still serving. And the NHS took the recommendations from Messenger and Pollard, combined them with the work of Fuller and Hewitt when they looked into a primary care and ICBs, and combined it also with the work of Ockenden and Kirkup on maternity services. And over the last year or so, the NHS has been distilling that down into, right, what is this? What are all of these really recent reports post-COVID? So it's taken into account that new reality. What are they saying to us about where management and leadership should go? And I've been part of that group that's been working on that within NHS England. So I will restrict what I say next to what is in the public domain. There was an intention to make an announcement about this, but then the general election was called, and of course that restricts what can be made in terms of new policy announcement. But just the other week, on the 13th of November at the NHS Providers Conference, the Secretary of State for Health made his address to the conference and had the following to say about the practice of leadership and management, and I've highlighted the key words. And the NHS is going to be publishing a leadership and management framework with a single code of practice for that skill. It will include a set of competencies and also a curriculum for helping develop and deliver those essential leadership capabilities. And that there will be a College of Executive and Clinical Leadership that's established where to provide a single source of what is good going forward. Now, no other detail has come out at the moment, but I think what's most interesting in all of this is, of course, a code of practice will be useful, but it's what are those competencies? What are we going to be focusing on? What is the crown jewels, if you like? Now, the NHS has yet to publish on that, but one thing I have offered into that team is the work of the Centre of Army Leadership. And this is free to access. The link's on the screen. It's not a restricted document in any way. And that was published just prior to summer holidays this year. And the Centre of Army Leadership had conducted a real 360-degree analysis of leadership and drawing it from all walks of life, not just military, to think, right, what makes a good leader? And they distilled it down into 3 components of leadership: what leaders are, their character; what leaders do, their action; and what leaders know, their knowledge. And they've set up a framework that then sits below that, and it's called the competency framework. And you can see on this particular screen in the center the aim of leadership, and it's to inspire others to succeed. A really interesting idea, but of course it's very egalitarian. It's rank and role agnostic, as one would hope. And the 3 components of leadership are then the next concentric circle out from that, about what leaders are, what leaders do, what leaders know. And then supporting each of those are then 3 competencies under each of the components. And I won't give you an eye test by asking you to go round them. You're more than welcome to have a look at the slides afterwards. But of those 9 competencies that are seen as important, what really strikes me is that 2/3 of them are about who you are as a person, how you behave, what you project, and how that then helps people to come together as a team, how well you know your people. Now, Kel, and if anyone else has got any military experience on the call, if someone had said to me 20 years ago that the future of British Army leadership would be self-awareness, self-knowledge, being aware of one's authenticity as a leader, as opposed to pointing and shouting and all of those good things that we stereotypically think about the military. If someone had said that to me 20 years ago, I would not have believed them. And I think this is a wonderful, wonderful development, that actually we're focusing in on who people are. And you'll see one of the segments there under the purple, what leaders know. What they know of their profession is just one element of it, 1/9 of that puzzle. And what I think will hopefully be helpful for the NHS within all of this is if we focus in on one of those 9 competencies, knowing oneself, there's a set of sub-skills there. And again, it's a bit of an eye test, so I won't ask you to look at it. But that's the framework, I think, for a curricula there. Really, really interesting stuff. And so if this is the British Army's, and it is the British Army's direction of travel, it's about you. It's all about you and who you are as a person. Then I'll just take us back to Slim. And so the closer we are to being an authentic leader, the closer we are to bringing our whole self to work and really taking that time to engage with the people around us, I think it's a really powerful thing. And in this time of service pressure and a lot of challenges in all works of public life, certainly, I think it's easy to forget so many of the commonalities that we have within public service. We have all come into public service driven by so many similar values, and we forget we share so many things together. So whilst we've got, I'm sure, some difficult relationships in all of our workplaces, taking that time to engage and to build those relationships and create the right culture at a local level can really make a difference. And I would just sort of espouse that to you. If you've got any questions or if you want to know more, do please feel free to drop me an email. I've got my military email address on the screen there. Our Defence Medical Services Leadership Development Team's email is also on the screen, and I've got a QR code there. Do please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's a great way of staying in touch and connected with people. And so on that note, I shall pause. I've hopefully left 10 minutes for questions, and more than happy to pick up on any subject anyone may have. Over to you.
Open the floor for questions. So if you want a question, if you've got a question for Brigadier Toby, put your hand up and we will run through them. But I'd just like to to mention that the Centre for Army Leadership, I'm really pleased to see that they have copied the Klein model for leadership, head, heart, hands, which we endorse. So I'm really pleased that we're on the same track. So yeah, really interesting. Okay, Angie, we have a question. Thanks, Angie. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Toby. Great to meet you. So I'm also from Llandrindod, so it's nice to meet a fellow Llandodi. And my question for you is, in addition to what you learned sort of through the military about your leadership and about other people's leadership, how has growing up in our hometown influenced your leadership values and the approach that you take?
Oh, I think that's a wonderful question. Well, I mean, sadly, I moved away. When would I have moved away? 91. So how many years ago is that? Crikey, 30 odd years. And most of the families now have. I've no living relatives still remaining in Llandrindod. So hopefully, you can tell me how it's changed. I think the benefit I had growing up in that time and in that area was a real sense of community. And I think the nearest cinema, well, was 10 miles away in Bill, which I'm sure is still the case, and the nearest department store, if you like, was in Hereford, which was a good hour and a bit drive. And things one used to see on the television, like ice rinks and multiplexes and major sporting venues, were a distant memory. And so one focuses in on what's around you. And I think that real sense of community and personal connection really gave me a wonderful ground and feeling part of something, to be quite frank. There was still a lot of civic pride in Llandrindod. We used to have, I don't know if you remember it from your time there, the Victorian Festival, celebrating our heritage. In full disclosure, I was the best dressed Victorian boy 2 years in a row at the very first two Victorian festivals. So a little claim to fame. It's not on the CV, Kel. I'll put it in future. And I think that sense of community is something we're all probably toying with in terms of what it means to us. And what are the challenges with social media and people perhaps not going out as much and not connecting in different ways. And there is a school of thought, actually. I'm sorry for perhaps going on this one a bit. Is that there is a school of thought that if one goes to university, the smaller the university one goes to, it's more likely to be exposed to different opinions and different backgrounds to your own. Whereas the bigger the organisation, the bigger the place you live in, the more likely you are to just surround yourselves with similar people and similar outlooks, because you're more likely to bump into them. And I think that's another advantage from coming from a relatively small place, is that you get exposed to diversity on a regular basis, rather than just getting an echo chamber of one's views. So that's what I just offer. Angie, I don't know what your views are on the benefits of growing up in Llandrindod.
Yeah, it's changed in some ways. I think there's more people who've come to live here who bring in their different perspectives and views on things. But in terms of what's available, that's pretty much stayed the same, I'll be honest. Went to the same university as well, so that's quite interesting. And I think it's sort of a necessary thing. It's a lovely place and a lovely community, but it's necessary to get out and see the world and to influence your opinions elsewhere, I think. So it's great to hear.
Absolutely. No, wonderful. And just as a bit of an afterthought from someone who moved away from Llandrindod, someone else, there was a woman who was one of my peers who went on to become a nurse and moved to New York and became used to write. And she was less favourable in her view of Llandrindod. I'm sad to say, in that she said, when asked to describe in the New York Times where she came from, she said Llandrindod is about the same size as a New York graveyard with about as much life, which I thought was rather unfair. But never mind. Sorry, enough of me. Who's next?
Brilliant. Okay, so we've got 2 hands up and 1 in the chat. So we'll go to Johnny first, please. Johnny.
Thanks. It probably actually sort of segues nicely with Matt's and actually that element about sort of larger communities. I was going to ask sort of in terms of the hierarchies and particularly in the army, but obviously they cross over well into the NHS. How have they set about and how do we set about sort of changing those leadership values that sort of we're trying to sort of remark on and you reflected on that sort of gap between the last 20 years and now?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question because there is a stereotypical view of the military that it's all pointing, shouting, and what I say goes. Well, certainly within the British military, we do have a tradition of engagement in that you do have that open discussion. You get everyone around the table, and everyone is invited to contribute to the discussion. That's if we've got time to do it, absolutely. But certainly in planning, it is quite egalitarian. But ultimately, I think what then distinguishes military leadership is then whoever's in charge, who's got the authority, the accountability, the responsibility, will make a decision, say, right, okay, having heard all the discussions, right, we're going left, we're going right, and everyone will just get on and do that. And so the rank and the responsibility help set up that pyramid so we know the decision making, and ultimately if we're faced with a rapidly changing situation, then absolutely the hierarchy is useful in those situations. I think in terms of the healthcare setting, with what I would observe is with increasing specialization, and the generalist is becoming less and less. You know, when you look at the number of general surgeons we're training now, as specialization increases, then logic dictates we have to invite more voices to the table. And with certainly when service pressures are applying, different people have different perspectives in terms of how best to manage the situation. So I think that's the logic for why we should adopt different practices. And unfortunately, you only have to look at some of the continued reviews of significant incidents where some catastrophic failures in care have occurred just simply because someone wasn't listened to, someone didn't feel able to speak up in those circumstances and situations. In terms of how one changes that organizationally, I have seen that done. It takes a real effort to do. It's more than just sending a memo out or an email or starting an email chain, one of those great things that we like to do within healthcare. And it requires that personal engagement. It's that setting of the example. And I think through practicing some of the skills that I've sort of shared with you now, it can create within microcosms, and I've seen this happen, the right sort of behaviours. But ultimately, we still need someone to take the decision. We still need someone to move forward. And I think the counterpoint to all of that is that there is an increasing tendency, I think, within healthcare to people to not want to make that final decision. And that can get us into some difficult situations. So it's by no means a simple equation, but I think it's an absolutely crucial one. If for no other reason than in times of pressure and difficulty, making sure that the team feels valued, making sure that they feel supported will help them through some really tough situations. That's what I just offered. Jonathan, if you want to come back and challenge on that, please do.
No, I think I guess the problem we've got in healthcare is it's just so diverse, and there is a lot of embedded behaviours that are sort of slow to change, and part of that is creating the ability for people to follow without necessarily agreeing, having been listened to. And I think we're haven't cracked that nut yet.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It is. Yeah, indeed. I think we'll have a longer conversation. I'm mindful of the time, but I'm more than happy to pick up on that one. Afterwards.
Thank you. No, great question, Johnny. I think we have run out of time, but there are 3 really delicious questions in the chat, and Tom also has his hand up. So I'm going to invite Tom to send me through a written question, and if it's okay, Brigadier, I can't call you Toby because you're a Brigadier. Brigadier. It's very weird. I will send them across to you and if you could provide a response, I will share them with the cohort, if that's okay, because we have reached our time limit. But it just leaves me to say a big climb thank you to the Brigadier for your personalised story and your 3 skills, which were active listening, compassionate leadership and psychological safety, which I'm sure we'll all have them ingrained on our brains for the future. So thank you so much for sparing the time, and hopefully you'll have time to hop on with Hari and Jane's session this afternoon, but if not, you have an open invite to any of our sessions. I have Brigadier Toby's presentation to share, so we'll share that after this. And I'd like to say thank you to the Climb alumni that have attended today. Thank you for coming back and participating. Thanks to Tori, our friend, who does like these Ed Talks too. We are now set to break for lunch until 13:30. We'll be back online with Hari and Jane from Johns Hopkins. But I will consolidate these questions and get them across to the Brigadier.